Friday, Monsters. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the MurderMurder News podcast, which also serves as a weekly meeting for our own true crime cult. But don't worry, you've landed in the cult with all of the flower crowns and none of the flavor aid. Allow us to introduce ourselves in case you're just finding us for the first time today. I'm Angelina, and I'm hanging with the real housewife of true crime herself, Aurora. How's your week going?
Well, it's going pretty great. Greetings from Marrakesh, everybody. Yeah. I'm in probably like my number one travel destination I've always wanted to go to my entire life for the first time. So I'm so excited to be here.
Dream vacation.
Yeah, definitely a dream vacation. And we're in a place where there is quite a bit of wildlife around. So I apologize if you can hear a crow outside my window or any of these other birds. We're trying to add some spooky
Aurora's
ambiance
already
for
making
you.
friends with birds.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not only am I the real housewife of true crime, but also the real Disney princess of true crime.
You're the spooky Snow White of true crime.
That's right. But how's your week going?
Oh, pretty good. I'm just planning a mini getaway to Prince Edward Island to visit Anne of Green Gables and what have you.
As you should. Like one of my childhood favorites. I'm so jealous.
Yeah, it's one of the few places in Canada that I have not been, so might as well. There's a little music festival. Are you going to do
like an Anne of Green Gables tour of any sort? Please say yes.
Probably. I haven't planned anything yet, but it's definitely on my radar. I don't think there's much else to do there, so there will be that and the music festival that's going on, and that's about it, I think, so.
Okay, we really need to get you like a red wig or some hair extensions so you can have some braids when you go. We need like 2 braids, and I'm going to need
clip-in
photos.
Braids.
Yes, clip-in little red braids.
Or
oh my God,
like some sort of braid headband.
Yes.
Like with braids stuck to it. I could do that.
I love it. Please do. Of course, we consider all of you listeners to be honorary monsters, but if you'd like to make it official, you can join the MMN commune at patreon.com/MurderMurderNews. There you can show your support for what we do by making a monthly pledge of whatever amount you like, whether you've got a few extra bucks or a few hundred. Hey, big spender. To show how much we appreciate your support, we'll give you a shout out on the show, give you a cool title like Deacon or Grandmaster of Goats, and you'll have exclusive access to our regular patron-only content.
We just posted our end of May special this week, which takes a closer look at the life of the woman who once vied for the title of Britain's most notorious madam, Joe Strummer's anti-establishment muse, and pen pal to the perpetrators of the infamous Moors murders, Ms. Janie Jones. Keep an eye out for what's next. We do post a Patreon exclusive at the end of each and every month.
Let's kick things off with a look at some of the true crime stories that made headlines this week.
There has been an update to the case of an unidentified child found in a suitcase in rural Washington County on April 16, 2022. Detectives and investigators with the Indiana State Police in Sellersburg have received the official autopsy and toxicology report. The suitcase was initially located in a heavily wooded area of eastern Washington County, southern Indiana. The case, emblazoned with a design of Las Vegas, contained the body of an unidentified child described as a young black male approximately 5 years old. The child is 4 feet tall, has a slim build, and a short haircut. Detectives have stated that the child was clothed and clean, and there's no evidence that he was alive when placed inside the suitcase. The official autopsy report states that there was an absence of significant traumatic injuries and no anatomical cause of death. The blood toxicology was negative, and the child's death has been attributed to an electrolyte imbalance, likely caused by viral gastroenteritis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Although numerous tips have been called in, investigators are still struggling to identify the boy and are not ruling out the possibility that the child could be from out of state or even out of the country. If you have any information regarding this case, please call the nationwide toll-free tip line at 1-800-437-6432.
Oh, so sad.
Yeah.
Well, chef and culinary professor Daniel Brophy was found shot dead inside of his classroom at the Oregon Culinary Institute in June of 2018. Last Wednesday, Nancy Crampton Brophy, an aspiring romance novel writer, blogger, and Daniel's wife, was found guilty of his second-degree murder. Nancy's motive appears to be economic, as the couple juggled a mountain of debt and had drained their retirement funds 2 years prior. Desperate Nancy stood to gain $1.5 million from Daniel's life insurance policy. In 2011, Nancy's writing career gave a bit of foreshadowing when she published an essay titled How to Murder Your Husband. The essay outlined different methods of killing a loved one and weighed out the pros and cons of each method. Never a good idea, Nancy.
No. Too obvious.
And sorry, I don't mean to make light of his death, but wow, Nancy.
Yeah, it's really something.
Yeah. Having failed to properly plan out exactly how to get away with murder, Compton Brophy will be sentenced next week to a minimum of 25 years in prison.
We'll be right back after a quick commercial break from one of our fellow Darkcast podcasts.
Hey there, friend. My name's Sarai, and I host a spooky, casual podcast called Freaky AF, where I tell you stories of conspiracies, true crime, and of the supernatural. So if that's your kind of shiz, come check us out. I'm sure we'll be great friends. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, and a bunch of other places. Or you can look us up on Twitter and Instagram. We're Freaky AF Pod. That's FREAKYAFPOD. Come get spooked, y'all.
And we're back.
We do want to make a quick announcement that we're about to take a short summer break. For the next 2 weeks, we won't be releasing a new episode. For subscribers, we will be dropping a couple of our favorite episodes from fellow Darkcasters to keep your true crime cups topped up.
We'll also be on social media, but not on any kind of a schedule. Enjoy random bursts of experimental content. Before we dig in, we want to offer a quick disclaimer. Though we joke about forming a true crime cult, that is not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, and we want you to know that we take the cases we're discussing very seriously.
We want to deliver each story with the utmost respect to victims and anyone involved. If you feel we've missed the mark, you don't like our tone, or if you notice we've gotten any details wrong, let us know with a quick email to murdermurdernews@gmail.com and we'll make it right. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include graphic descriptions of brutal violence and child murder. If either of those subjects are particularly sensitive for you, feel free to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
We had a comment on our last episode about the Axeman of New Orleans that it felt more like a horror story than a true crime case. Well, if horror stories are your jam, you'll also love this episode. What went down at Lake Bodom this week in true crime history is like Friday the 13th meets the Axeman. It begs the questions, was it a serial killer? Or has local legend spun things so far out of control that we may never know the truth? Finland's Lake Bodom is where horror, urban legend, and true crime intersect. I want to give a special shout out to Arkham Rebel on darkideas.net, who translated a number of articles to provide more backstory than any of our other sources for today's episode. Also, the podcast based on a true crime, which I thought was clever and would definitely listen to more episodes. One host is a true crime fan, the other is a horror film buff, and each episode explores a horror movie based on a true crime. Ooh. So there's a horror movie of this, loosely based on this as well. It's like they revisit the haunted campground. So maybe worth a watch. Haven't seen it. Other sources for today's episode include Mental Floss, Grunge.com, Historic Mysteries, and Medium. As usual, a complete list of our sources can be found in the description of today's episode.
Finland, a Nordic country in Northern Europe, borders Sweden, Norway, and Russia. The official language of Finland are Finnish and Swedish. Finland has a strikingly low crime rate, with the vast majority of criminal activity being related to motorcycle gangs. Finland's murder rate in particular is startlingly low. Wikipedia lists just 3 serial killers and 9 unsolved murders in Finnish history. The downside of the low crime rate is that police force may not be so experienced, particularly when handling gruesome murder cases. Finland regularly earns the title of least corrupt country, so police corruption is not much of a concern. Inadequacy is another story. The investigation into the murders at Lake Bodom, for example, is positively riddled with inadequacies, which we'll get to. First, let's get better acquainted with Finland. Vast pine forests, clusters of shimmering birch trees, and crystal clear lakes of ice-cold water make up the Finnish countryside. One such lake is Lake Bodom, the scene of the horrific murders we're going to talk about today. If you want to get closer to Lake Bodom and really immerse yourself in this story, Children of Bodom, a heavy metal band from Espoo, inspired by the case, brew and sell their own beer made of water from Lake Bodom. We'll post a link in today's episode description. In the summertime, the sun never sets in Finland. The spookiest time of the day remains the middle of the night. For a few hours each summer night, generally between 3 and 5:30 a.m., Finland is quiet and bright. Is that, as an aside here, the country in 30 Rock where Jane is trying to, or what's her name on the show, is trying to film like a horror movie? It's like a vampire movie or something, but it's only dark for like 30 seconds a day, so they only can film for 30 seconds a day. Do you remember that episode?
I'm not sure. I do, but I'm not sure if it was like somewhere more... like more wintry. I don't know. I know there's like, wintry territories that are like that too, but
right.
I don't know.
May or may not be Finland, but yeah, that must be very interesting being in some place like that for sure.
Yeah.
Birds and forest critters stuck in the ways of their diurnal rhythm nap all at once. Even the most dedicated fishermen know it's not worth sticking around the lakeside during these still hours. As Arkham Rebel put it, the forest feels unsettling, as if a predator is near. Prior to the 1950s, campers had only that stillness to fear.
Maila Bjorklund and Anja Maki, two 15-year-old girls, set out on a camping trip one hot June afternoon in 1960 with their boyfriends, Seppo Boisman and Nils Gustafsson, who were both 18. The two young couples left their homes in Vanta on two motorbikes and drove 16 miles westward to Lake Bodom. 20 kilometers west of Helsinki, in a town called Espoo, the shores of Lake Bodom host hundreds of campers each summer. The friends pitched a single tent for all of them to share in the most secluded spot they could find, out on a tiny peninsula, which, as an aside, has since been renamed... I'm going to probably butcher this, but I'll try and pronounce it. Something like Muriniemi, which translates to Murder Peninsula. At least it's named that now on Google Maps. They camped out most of the week without incident, as is evident from Maila's journal, which was later recovered from the teenagers' tent. They did a bit of swimming, some fishing, and the boys got drunk. On the fifth day of camping at Lake Bodom, Maila wrote in her journal that Seppi and Nils were drunk and up at 2 a.m. and that Seppi was fishing. To clarify, Seppi seems to be Seppo's nickname. He was dating Anja, and Maila was Nils's girlfriend.
In the early morning of June 5th, 1960, two boys who were birdwatching hiked along the shore of Lake Bodom and noticed the group's tent from a distance. Around 6 a.m., Kalevi Hapolainen and Heikki Salonen ventured a little closer to the campsite until they could see that the tent looked torn, but that's the only detail the boys could make out about it. They did say they saw a pair of legs sticking out of the tent and a man with long blonde hair walking away from the campsite. They didn't think much of any of this at the time and continued on their hike. When questioned later, they were able to give a description of the blonde man they saw. He was 20 to 30 years old, around 5'8", wearing dark pants and a light shirt. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, a carpenter named Esko Johansson went swimming in the lake with his son. They also noticed the collapsed and ripped tent and swam in closer for a better look. Being 1960, there were no cell phones and no car phones, so when the father and son noticed bodies sticking out from the tent fabric, which was stained with blood, they ran into town to call the police from a payphone, which they did at 11:15 a.m. While they were looking for a payphone, another man named Sigurd Volasama also stumbled onto the site of the massacre and ran in the other direction to call the police from another payphone. And again, we're so sorry, Finnish listeners, for these pronunciations. Yeah. It was very tough.
Yeah, we're definitely trying our best. But if you want to correct us, feel free. We'd be happy to learn some new pronunciations. Responding officers were astounded to find that in a bloody mess of 4 bodies, one of the teens was still alive. He had sustained a broken jaw and a cut on his cheek so large that you could see his teeth through it. He'd received such a hard blow to the back of his head that cerebral fluid was leaking out of his nose. The doctors that treated Nils Gustafsson said that if he had gone much longer without medical attention, he likely would have died. As brutal as Gustafsson's injuries were, His friends fared far worse. Beside Nils, Anja Maki's body was half inside and half on top of the tent. She was frozen in fetal position, which either means that she'd curled up before she succumbed to her injuries, which seems most likely, or that the killer had positioned the body. Anya's jaw was broken in 2 places, and at least one of her teeth had been knocked out. The other 2 bodies were completely obscured by the tent fabric when they were found. Seppo Boisman had been bludgeoned in the head, which cracked his skull and broke his jaw. He'd been stabbed several times around the head and neck. His cause of death was determined to be blood inhalation. Forensic examiners determined that the way Boisman was lying on his back, it was likely that he'd still been asleep when the assailant struck. The worst of the bunch was the attack on Maila Bjorklund. She had several defensive wounds on her arms, which means she went out fighting. She, like the others, was bludgeoned and had been stabbed a total of 15 times. Her pants were pulled down and completely off one leg so that she was left partially naked. The forensic team surmised that someone had snuck up on the tent, cutting the guy ropes so that the canvas walls fell over the campers inside like a booby trap, immobilizing them and completely obscuring their vision. As the group struggled to find the tent's opening and escape, their attacker bludgeoned them through the canvas fabric of the tent, likely with a large rock. The killer then went into a frenzy, slicing through the canvas in several places and stabbing the tent's occupants in turn.
As the investigation kicked off, the first of many blunders was when the police failed to secure the crime scene. Campers at Lake Bodom, curious onlookers, reporters, and investigators hired to assist all trampled over potential evidence and destroyed any possibility of police lifting fingerprints or shoe prints from the scene. The teen's belongings were scattered around the site, and it wasn't immediately clear what, if anything, was missing from the scene. A soda bottle found bobbing in the lake was dusted for fingerprints, but it's not clear whether the bottle was affiliated in any way with the campers or their assailant. What's more, the officer sent by the KRP, the local police force, spoke only Swedish and couldn't understand much of what the primarily Finnish-speaking locals said. Many of these locals later hurled accusations at the KRP ignoring evidence. In time, it was determined that aside from the missing murder weapons, the group's wallets and watches were lifted, their cigarettes taken, Seppo's knife was MIA, and neither Nils nor Seppo's shoes were anywhere to be found. The boys' motorcycles were still parked on site, but the keys had been thrown away. A baffling bit of evidence that was mysteriously disregarded was a rolled-up pillowcase tied at either end with elastic bands. The pillowcase was stained with blood and semen. Being the 1960s, forensic science was not what it is now, and investigators found it impossible to determine the owner of the bloodstains on the pillowcase. This might have been simply because it was a mix of the victim's blood and couldn't be traced to a single source. The semen, it was clear, belonged to neither of the boys in the group that was attacked. Oh well, not important.
Right. Almost every piece of evidence investigators recovered at the scene has since been destroyed. Many of the teens' belongings were fully saturated in blood and were thrown out. A blanket that the group used to line the floor of their tent under the sleeping bags and a leather jacket that one of the teens had used as a pillow were returned to family members and eventually also destroyed. Of the evidence recovered, the only items that managed to evade destruction were Maila's journal and the boys' shoes, which were found 500 meters away from the campsite. Miraculously, after being rushed to the hospital, Nils Gustafsson was conscious and speaking, and had some memories of camping at Lake Bodom with his friends. His memories of the attack were a little fuzzier. At first, he claimed that a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes descended upon the sleeping teens. Local lore says that Death himself, or the Grim Reaper, had perpetrated the attack. Since that's definitely not what happened, let's explore some theories of what might have happened at Lake Bodom that night. Who were the suspects and what brought them under suspicion?
The first and most obvious suspect is a man named Carl Gillstrom. Locals knew him by the nickname Kiosk Man because he owned a kiosk near the campground on Lake Bodom. Many witnesses interviewed said it was easy to see the 4 teens weren't local to Espoo, nor regular campers at Lake Bodom, or they would have known better than to pitch their tent on that particular peninsula. Kiosk Man took pride in the area of Lake Bodom and considered himself to be its caretaker. It was well known in the area that Gillstrom hated campers, especially kids, and he loathed noisy motorcycles. Kiosk Man sounds like a regular Charles Bronson, straight out of Death Wish. He'd hide razor blades in the apples he'd put out to get vengeance on thieves who pilfered from his fruit display. He'd throw, how would he know which fruit was going to be stolen? This sounds terrible. What in the world? Right. Yeah, not good. He'd throw rocks at cyclists, shoot at cars, and cut the guy ropes of tents that he didn't want on what he felt was his land. Police were also informed about a well on Gillstrom's property that he mysteriously filled in during the days that followed the murders. The KRP had a quick look at Carl Gillstrom's property and a short chat with his wife, who told them that her husband was in bed with her all night on June 4th and well into the morning of the 5th. That was good enough for them, and they were on their way.
Not so fast, said the locals. Gillstrom was an abusive alcoholic who beat his wife and kids. Of course she would give him an alibi. She's scared of him. Said the KRP, meh. Some insist Gillstrom should be reinvestigated, but that never came to be. Not when Gillstrom allegedly made a drunken confession to some neighbors. Not after Gillstrom drowned himself in Lake Bodom in 1969, completing suicide and left behind a note that some say alludes to his involvement in the murders. Not when Gillstrom's widow, on her deathbed, recanted the alibi she had provided for her late husband. Not when politician Ulf Johansson wrote a book, The Legend of Bodom, in which he claims to have evidence that Gillstrom spent some time in a psychiatric facility. Not ever. Just as an aside, the fact that he drowned and his body remained in the lake for a short while rendered it impossible for investigators to collect a DNA sample post-mortem. Not that any such sample could have been tested in the 60s, but it could have been collected for future testing, and maybe this case wouldn't feel so destined to remain forever a cold case. You might find all of this negligence frustrating until you hear about this next suspect.
The unfortunately named Hans Assmann first came into view as just a weird as fuck patient who showed up to the emergency ward of a local hospital sometime during June 6th. Dirt lined his fingernails, and there were suspicious stains splashed onto his clothing. Medical staff recalled that Assmann seemed nervous and at one point seemed to pretend to pass out. Dr. Jorma Paulo called the police, but says they weren't interested in taking a statement from him or pursuing his tip. In 2003, Dr. Paulo released his book, Bodom's Riddle, which introduced Hans Assmann as a possible suspect to the wider public. Reasons why Hans Assmann looks guilty include that as soon as the KRP released a sketch of the man with long blonde hair walking away from the scene of the crime, he cut his hair. The sketch was not based solely on the description provided by the boys who were birdwatching nearby. Ovlavi Kivalati, who was fishing on the shore of Lake Bodom early in the morning on June 5th, also described a man who bore a startling resemblance to Hans Assmann walking away from the campsite that morning. At one point, Nils Gustafsson was hypnotized. Under hypnosis, he described a more plausible version of events than the grim tale he had previously told investigators. Neil said he awoke when the canvas walls of the tent fell over him and managed to get a good look at the assailant's face before he left the scene. A blonde man with long hair, about 25, who matched the descriptions provided by other witnesses, despite the fact that there's no way Nils would have seen the sketches or heard the descriptions that had already been provided to police. Doctors have pointed out that the memories lost to amnesia caused by brain damage can't be recovered under hypnosis, which has led some to question the credibility of Gustafsson's report and whether he had lied about what he remembered from the attack. It makes sense if we consider the memories folks can suppress and subconsciously block out to protect themselves from the effects of PTSD.
Hans Assmann lived close by to Lake Bodom, and neighbors in the community gossiped that perhaps he had been a guard at Auschwitz, which was likely false. He did, however, serve with the German Air Force in World War II. Assmann was captured in Russia in 1943 and held as a prisoner of war for 2 years, which has led to rumors that he was an agent with the KGB. Some believe the KRP ignored him because of his KGB links. Hans' wife, Yano, had earlier come under suspicion as a possible spy because she had lived in multiple countries and sometimes used a different name. The police dismissed Hans Assmann as a suspect in 1960, saying he had a, quote, strong alibi. It later came out that this so-called strong alibi was just that his wife said he was home all night, and their landlord, who happened to be a distant relative of Hans, backed her up. Some even suggested this alibi was coerced. The year after the massacre at Lake Bodom, Hans was arrested for domestic violence when he beat Viano in front of witnesses, kicking her multiple times after she fell to the ground. After the couple divorced in the 70s, Viano frequently called tips about her ex-husband into police, saying that he happened to be in the vicinity when a number of major crimes were committed. This includes the murders of Lake Bodom and a few others, some of which sound eerily similar to the 1960 attack.
For example, 17-year-old Kailiki Sari disappeared on her way to a prayer meeting on May 17, 1953. That October, her body was discovered in a shallow grave marked by a sharpened stick staked into the ground. The sharpened stick hadn't been there in earlier searches of the area, which meant that the killer had likely revisited the site months later, marking the spot at that point. Kailiki was found to have been bludgeoned in the head with a blunt object, her nose and cheekbones shattered. The coroner believed the weapon in question was probably a rock. Sari was found naked from the waist down, and the sharpened stick marked her grave had been driven so hard into the ground that it pierced through her stomach.
In December of 1955, a young student named Ellie Imo was attacked just as she approached the gate to her house as she returned home from a dance. Her body was found slumped in the driveway the next morning. She'd been stabbed in the neck and behind the ear. The only clue police had was the description of a man she'd been seen dancing with, who bore a strong resemblance to none other than Hans Assmann.
The murders for which Hans had been fingered that most closely echoed the details of Lake Bodom attack are two attacks on campers in Finnish campgrounds. 21-year-old Aine Naisanen and 23-year-old Rita Pakanen disappeared during a 2-week-long bike trip in 1959. After they were reported missing, investigators traced their path to Tulaladi campground, where they found the missing woman's tent. Rita had been bludgeoned, likely by a rock. Aine had been stabbed and stripped naked. A sharpened stick had been staked into the ground nearby. Witnesses had described two German men buying maps at a nearby kiosk shortly before the murders took place. The description of one of the men matched Hans Assmann.
24 years after the murders at Lake Bodom, 30-something married couple Jani and Marinus Stighuis, I hope is how you pronounce that, were camping across Sweden and Finland. After driving through Sjöfallet National Park, they pitched their tent at a campsite by Lake Apojoare. In the early morning hours of July 14th, 1984, a pair of hikers came across the couple's collapsed tent. Marinus and Jani had been bludgeoned and stabbed. The inside of their sliced-up tent was a veritable bloodbath. Each victim had been stabbed at least 20 times. Like Seppo Boisman, Marinus was found on his back inside the tent as though he had slept through the attack. Jani was bent at the waist at a 90-degree angle. This implies that either she awoke and sat up to meet her attacker before she died, which is most likely, or that the killer had posed the body, just like Anja Maki at Lake Bodom all those years ago.
Hans Assmann hasn't been convicted of any of the aforementioned murders. Today, all of them are cold cases. Years later, a photo surfaced on the internet, allegedly from the funeral for the Lake Bodom victims. In the photo, right in the middle of the crowd, is a man who is either Hans Assmann or closely resembles Hans Assmann. This photo either adds to the case against Assmann, or if the man in the photo is not, in fact, Assmann, then Assmann is likely innocent in the Lake Bodom killings. Regardless, the man in the photo certainly seems to be the same man described by multiple witnesses, including Nils Gustafsson for police sketch artists.
Over the course of the investigation, an incredible 4,000 witnesses were interviewed. Much of the information provided by witnesses helped investigators to build a case against each of the probable witnesses. However, with much of the physical evidence having been mishandled at best, destroyed at worst, it seems there has never been enough to charge, never mind convict, any of the aforementioned suspects. 45 years after the fact, Nils Gustafsson, then a 63-year-old retired bus driver with 2 grown children, was tried for his friend's killings. The media and the Finnish public were dumbfounded by this sudden twist, particularly because Gustafsson had walked free for over 4 decades since the murders without any question about his innocence. What changed to make investigators redirect their focus towards Lake Bodom's only surviving victim? In 2004, the KRP partnered with British law enforcement in hopes that fresh forensic tactics and an advanced technology might shed some new light on the cold case. A modern-day blood spatter analysis was performed on the tent and on Nils Gustafsson's shoes. The shoes had blood on the outside, but none on the inside, indicating that they were worn during the attack. And investigators somehow got it in their heads that the shoes must have been worn by the attacker. It seems unlikely that a random attacker might slip into his victim's shoes during an attack, so investigators deduce that Gustafsson must have attacked his friends.
Another point of negligence is that no one seems to have tested Seppo Boisman's shoes, despite the fact that his shoes were also missing from the scene and later recovered alongside Gustafsson's shoes 500 meters away from the campsite. As was pointed out on darkideas.net, if nothing else, it would have been useful to subject Boisman's shoes to the same test as Gustafsson's shoes as a control. Aside from the blood stains existing only on the exterior of the shoes, forensic experts revealed the blood from each of Gustafsson's friends were detected on the shoes, but there was no blood from Gustafsson himself. It was theorized that perhaps after killing his friends, Nils hid the shoes and then created some self-inflicted wounds and lay down with his victims. Although he was just 18 at the time, and in the photos from the hospital, he looked like a little kid, police mused that perhaps the blonde man that several witnesses had seen leaving the scene was Nils, on his way to hide the shoes and get rid of the murder weapons. A new witness came forward claiming the boys had stopped by to visit her and her friends at their campsite, which was a little further down along the shore of Lake Bodom. She recalled that the 2 boys had been very drunk and that Nils was acting aggressive and kept trying to fight Seppo.
Based on the testimony of this new witness, the prosecution cobbled together a story that Nils and Seppo had had a physical fight earlier in the night, which is where Nils incurred his injuries. Seppo had punched Nils in the face, breaking his jaw. Back at the campsite, Nils was exiled from the tent for his ratty behavior, and his girlfriend Maila rejected his sexual advances. His retaliation was to violently murder the 3 friends that he had been camping with for the better part of a week. Bjorklund's rejection earned her the worst of her attacker's wrath. The prosecution was calling for a life sentence for Gustafsson. The defense reminded everyone just how serious Nils' injuries had been, and how unlikely it was that a punch to the face cracked his skull so badly that cerebral fluid dripped from his nose, or that he somehow cut such a large hole in his own cheek that his teeth could be seen through it. The prosecution suggested that his injuries may have been recorded as worse than they actually were, and allegedly they had some medical staff to back that up. Regardless, it sure seems like a feat for a drunk and badly injured teenager to carry out a vicious multiple murder in his condition. And why had this witness sat silent for all these years? One of the few pieces of physical evidence kept from the crime scene was Maila Bjorklund's journal. In her last journal entry, Maila mentioned the boys drinking, but she didn't say anything about any fight. You would think it would be worth mentioning, particularly if Nils had been badly injured.
There were more than a few holes in the theories that prosecution put forth. Gustafsson's clothes weren't kept or tested, and no one even mentioned his clothing being covered in blood. Could he have killed 3 people and only spilled blood onto the outside of his shoes? When he was found badly injured and flopped on top of the collapsed tent, he had socks on but no shoes. His socks weren't dirty from the alleged 500-meter walk back to the tent after discarding the shoes. Are we supposed to imagine he took off his socks, walked barefoot, wiped off his feet, put his socks back on, and then lay down with his murdered friends? Sounds like a little bit of a stretch. All 4 of the teens had broken jaws, which sure seems like they were all faced with the same external attacker, Nils included. Nils' blood was also found inside the tent, which strikes down the whole theory of his being exiled from the tent, attacking his friends from the outside. No one seems to know what to make of the old, bloody, semen-stained, rolled-up pillowcase that was found at the scene. So the defense and the prosecution concur that it had probably been left behind by other campers. It's also pretty curious if we were to imagine that Gustafsson attacked his friends, that for the rest of his life, he had never had a run-in with the law. He was never so much as rumored to direct any kind of violence towards his wife or their children. He didn't struggle with alcohol or other addictions. He sure as heck didn't murder anyone else, and we would expect that the perpetrator of a massacre like this at Lake Bodom to display some kind of pattern and kill again.
On October 7, 2005, Nils Gustafsson was cleared of all counts. That verdict rendered because the prosecution's evidence was inconclusive. The case was deemed ridiculous and disrespectful, and Nils Gustafsson was awarded 44,000 euros in damages because of the way he had been treated by police and the media. Still, suspicion of Gustafsson's guilt persists. Of course, any true crime fan knows that just because someone is cleared or acquitted, it doesn't mean they're not guilty. Along the same lines, just because someone is never charged for any crimes, it doesn't mean they aren't a serial killer. But the more time passes, it's hard not to lose faith that the murders at Lake Bodom will ever be solved, and that the case won't just slip further into obscurity as the decades roll by. As Mr. K on Medium put it, certainty regarding the facts is now impossible given the passage of time. Today, Nils Gustafsson is an octogenarian, having celebrated his 80th birthday last month. As of the time that we're recording this episode, the murders at Lake Bodom remain unsolved, a long-time cold case. But thanks to local lore, the legend lives on.
Wow.
Yeah, intense.
Yeah, I've been curious about this one for a while because I had read that I think it's like Friday the 13th was like kind of loosely inspired by this at least. And I had read like a little like blurb about this, but I hadn't really done a deep dive. So really fascinating.
Yeah, especially when you consider that there was a couple of other campsites where murders took place that this Hans Assmann was a suspect or at least being considered for.
Which is very suspicious for sure. Is he still alive? Like, what do we know about him today?
I don't think he's still alive. He would have been much older.
Yeah.
So I don't think he would be like over 100 years old.
Oh, that's true. He was in World War II. Yeah. So he...
Yeah.
Right.
But I guess, he never got charged or convicted with any of those murders.
Wow.
So they are all cold cases, which is really sad. But the weirdest thing about this case is just that each and every possible suspect sounds so convincingly suspicious,
Yeah.
It's like, as we get into one by one, even Nils, at times, you're like, well, there's some things that are just not adding up. But
yeah, and the kiosk guy definitely sounds plausible. Nils, to me, does not, because
he's the least plausible.
And certainly there's many cases where the murderer has inflicted injuries to themselves to make themselves look innocent, or they were attacked too, like that. We come across those cases all the time. But the fact that they could see his teeth, it was so severe.
I've never heard of anyone breaking their own face open as a false self-inflicted injury.
No, that's really taking it too far. The shoes being far away doesn't make any sense. The pillowcase with semen, because it didn't sound like the blood. Oh, the blood wasn't identified as being the victims. They couldn't tell at the time. Is that how it went?
But
right?
They figured it might have been a mix of the victim's blood.
It could have been,
but the semen definitely didn't belong to
right.
either of those boys. So that is very suspicious.
Right.
And obviously they didn't get samples from people like Hans Assmann to control, against this, to test against the semen.
If they did. Matched.
Yeah, definitely. There's something there that unfortunately was let go. So
too many loose ends.
We may never know.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So what are you watching this week?
The only thing, I thought I had watched something because I'm so excited about Only Murders in the Building coming back out in June. And it's all I can think about.
Yeah.
And it's like, I will not miss that.
Yeah. I heard that Cara Delevingne is going to be Selena Gomez's love interest.
I heard that.
I am looking forward to that.
Very cute. Me too. But no, I think I just watched more like fluffy, like I finished up the Circle finale, whatever, with the season with the Spice Girls. And the finale is just fantastic. So that was it.
I still haven't watched that, but I will watch it.
Highly recommend. But how about you?
I've just been watching season 4 of Stranger Things came out. So I've been sort of mini binging. But yeah, that's left me very little time for true crime. I haven't watched anything true crimey at all, but I promise after coming back from our break, I'm going to have some fresh recommendations.
Yeah, I think it's that. I think with all of the wild month we've had, I just haven't had any more bandwidth for true crime. I've just needed palate cleansers.
It's like, this is why we take breaks after we just a couple weeks of a breather. And then we're like, wait, give me all the true crime. What did I miss? And we're right into it again.
It is too much murder.
Yeah, it's true. Our murder capacity might be lower than our listeners even. I don't know.
It is right now, but we'll come back after this break, fully rested and ready for true crime TV and podcast talk. Both these things.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. If you need more, you can always find us on MurderMurder.news for the latest breaking true crime news articles every day of the week.
You can also find us on Instagram at MurderMurderNews, on Twitter at MurderNews, on TikTok at MurderMurderNews, and on Facebook, you can search for MurderMurder News, where you'll see our page pop up.
And when you're on Facebook searching for Murder Murder News, you'll also see our group pop up. You'll want to join us there to chat about all things true crime, but also to stay in the loop about our upcoming virtual events and our book club selections. We just finished up the Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, which we discussed on Zoom last weekend, and surprise, it's the first of a series. Keep an eye out for more Murder Club novels from Richard Osman. This month, we're reading Missing from the Village by Justin Ling, which tells the story of serial killer Bruce McArthur, who plucked his victims from Toronto's gay village in the 2010s.
Ooh, that sounds very good. And do not forget that if you love our show, you need to let us know by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast listening platform of choice. 5-star reviews really help us keep afloat. They help new fans find our show, and they help let us know which content you've been loving the most. We can keep creating more of what you like.
Thanks again for listening. We'll see you after the break. We're back on Friday, June 24th. Have a wonderful couple weeks, and we'll see you back here when it is officially summer.
Bye, friends.
Bye.